So, hello everyone. This is our weekly Monday evening um, live stream, and this is our chance for a Q&A, question and answer, and just general discussion of Dhamma with anyone who wants. So, please let me know how the sound is and if the quality of the audio is problematic. For those who don't know, I just arrived in Seattle, beginning to move forward with sort of staying in the area, and we're hoping to establish this community called Clear Mountain. So I posted our website there, but I've been given a place to stay by a very kind couple named Dave and Allison. So I'm in their basement. It's a great place, and have been going on alms every morning, every weekday morning to Pike Place Market, and really depending on the generosity of people there. This is one of the more beautiful aspects of the monastic life, is getting to surrender to the generosity, the unsolicited generosity for your daily meal of strangers. And it works. Which is the miraculous thing, is that there's good people everywhere. So my first day, I waited in front of the Pike Place Market, Starbucks, and a bakery called La Peignée, and there were I think maybe 5 or 6, maybe 5 spontaneous offerings. Of course, I was in front of a bakery, so they were mostly croissants, but it was still deeply heartening. And yeah, the sort of landing in Seattle, it'll be quite an adventure and a blessing to see what community forms. So, forgive me for reaching up here. This is what I have to do for this session. If people have topics they want to discuss, this is when you're welcome to type them into the chat and we can talk. So while we're waiting, good evening all. While we're waiting, perhaps I might speak to just, we've been holding these afternoon Zoom sessions right before this on Monday afternoons, or you can see the exact time on the website. But a question came up today around someone feeling somewhat ostracized from their Sangha community, and just feeling sort of alienated from a group that had been really sustaining, and wondering how to deal with that. And what it made me reflect on was how do I put it? The fact that of the 8 worldly winds that the Buddha lays out, pain, pleasure, gain, loss, fame, disrepute, praise, blame, 4 of them have to do with this aspect of what others think of us. It's almost like the Buddha almost repeated these, praise and blame and fame and disrepute are quite similar. And just to acknowledge the intensity of those needs for acceptance and how they determine so much of how we feel. You think of chimps in a troop, and what it meant to be ostracized was death. And so in some ways, I feel like those 4 winds are more powerful in a lot of ways than even, the more coarse forms of gain and loss, or pleasure and pain. And I think when being ostracized or going through some really difficult fissure socially, that reflection of just holding oneself in that space, and that really touching that first noble truth. And time and again, I'm moved by the Four Noble Truths, which the Buddha really spoke of as one of the two categorical teachings he had given. Categorical in that they were applicable in every situation. The other teaching is the four right efforts of cultivating wholesome mind states, bringing into being mind states, wholesome mind states that have not yet arisen, restraining unwholesome mind states from arising, and then abandoning unwholesome mind states that have arisen. But the Four Noble Truths, and specifically that entry point into suffering and our pain, our initial wound, and what it means to come back to that in our moments of deepest distress. How sometimes the crucible that the world acts as for us is so large that the one solid piece of land one has to stand on is the Four Noble Truths and coming back to one's own suffering and just being that. And I think there are times in practice where our whole duty is to keep our heads down and not fall apart. And I think that can be a helpful recollection at times. And also that the touching that suffering, the profundity of that first truth, if approached with grace and care and compassion, is proportional to the grace of, or the power of, the three noble truths which emerge from and after it. So if we go through great suffering, but with a great deal of wisdom, then the level of self-effacement and humility and spiritual purification which can emerge is that profound, that much more so. I think that that's a powerful recollection for me sometimes. That one of the meanings of the homeless life is not, the Buddha says that one who wanders shackled by lust for these five aggregates, the body, the personality, these things that we take as a self. One who wanders shackled by the lust for those things wanders around in a home, rattles around in a home. Whereas one who wanders without being bound by lust for those things wanders homeless. And this speaks for me to an essential movement in our orientation towards the world. Do we look at the world and our conditions as a refuge and a place to gain some sort of stability? Or can we look at this whole journey in life as a practice, as a tool to shape us into something bigger and greater, to move our hearts towards being something much broader? There's one really extreme example of this I heard from a teacher whose disciple, or one of the students he had lost her child in a car accident. He'd been run over or hit by a car in front of their house. And as she was driving back from the hospital, this one voice kept resounding in her head of, "I cannot let this destroy me." And she went on to become I think a chaplain. And whenever other parents had lost children, she was the one they would call, because she was the only one who could speak to that sort of pain. And that's an unbelievably harsh example, and one that I, in many ways, have no right to speak to. But just to say that I do think our suffering can, if approached with great courage, shape us into tools and vessels of compassion for the world. And a greater suffering, sometimes, when held right, can shape us into an even greater tool. And this, for me, is one meaning and implication of the Four Noble Truths, is that if one can approach that first noble truth, that initiating wound, with care and real attention and restraint, then the grace and majesty of the heart which come out of it, as incarnate in the other three noble truths of realizing the cause of craving, or abandoning the cause, realizing the cessation of suffering, peace, and practicing for the end of that cessation, those can be all the more profound for that. So I was really grateful that this person had brought this up in that session, because it's a powerful reminder of what we're called to do in this practice and on this path, in terms of not turning away from that. And I love that story of Chogyam Trungpa, who was visiting monasteries with an entourage of Tibetan lamas, and one of the Tibetan mastiffs that guards the monastery broke loose from its chain and charged them all. And they all ran away except for Chogyam Trungpa, who charged straight back at the dog. And it got so frightened that it ran away from him. And for me, that speaks a bit to how we must approach our suffering, is there's no neutral stance. Either we're fleeing from it, or we're very consciously turning towards it and placing our hands on it and feeling its shape and being shaped by it in a wholesome way with right wisdom. So we have time for some questions. Venerable, what's the next portion of delusion to eliminate to attain Sakadagami? Thank you. Diane in Toronto. So Diane's speaking to one of the levels of enlightenment. So there's 4 levels of awakening described in the Buddhist texts. There's stream entry, where the fetters, there's 10 fetters which are said to bind one to samsara, to rebirth. And all 10 must be eliminated for complete awakening. So the initial stage of awakening is called sotapanna, or stream entry. And at that level, the fetters abandoned are doubt, self-view, and doubt, self-view, and why is this not coming to mind? Okay, I'll let it come. The next one is Sakadagami, where all the fetters are weakened somewhat and attenuated. The third stage of awakening is Anagami, which is a non-returner. Basically, one is said to not come back into a rebirth, in a human rebirth. And the portion of delusion, which I believe that this questioner is referring to, are the next 2 fetters, which are abandoned when one moves to that level of awakening, the third level of a non-returner. And that, I believe, is sensual desire and ill will. So, and then to move from that level to complete awakening, arahantship, one further abandons 5 additional fetters. Desire for rebirth in the fine material realms, desire for rebirth in the material in the immaterial realms, conceit, restlessness, and I believe ignorance. And I remember hearing these 4 levels, and they just seemed like such an esoteric parsing out of stages of awakening, it was not terribly convincing to me until I heard Longpo Sumedho's description. And, oh, I'm sorry, and the third fetter abandoned at stream entry is Silapata Paramasa, which is attachment to rites and rituals, or cultural norms is how some people express that, although that's not quite as specified in the Buddha's description. But Longpo Sumedho's take on these I found very helpful. So the first three fetters abandon at stream entry, the first impact of the heart with awakening, where it's irreversibly changed. And the idea is that once the heart has experienced the deathless nibbana at that level, even for a brief moment, even though it draws back, it can't go over to complete awakening immediately, and returns. But the idea is that it's irreversibly changed, and that there's only a set number of rebirths, which one will come to after that. But the fetters that are abandoned are personality view, skeptical doubt, and attachment to rites and rituals. And Longpo Sumedho makes the really good point that all three of those fetters are cultural conditionings. So they're things we take on after we're born. Self-view or personality view is the view we gain. I'm a man, I'm a woman, this is my name, my race, my nationality, this is my personality. The attachment to rites and rituals has a great deal to do with the cultural norms we operate in, the things we assume make a difference, how we interact with others in terms of those cultural rituals which are so deeply interwoven into our lives. Although I think in the Buddha's exact articulation of them, they have more to do with sort of the Brahminical ritualization of purification. And yet most teachers I've heard speak to them in this broader context. And then skeptical doubt of the teaching is a bit separate, but related. The fetters that are abandoned when one moves to another stage of awakening of anagami, non-returner, sensual desire and ill will, these are biological fetters. They're biological conditioners. So all biological beings, and this is just built into our bodies, we have sensual desire. We want to eat, to experience pleasure, and we push away what's unpleasant. So those fetters are at the level of the body, and so they take much longer to attenuate. And the five fetters that one abandons at complete awakening, arahantship, which are these desire for rebirth in the fine material and immaterial realms, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. Those are much to do with the mind. It's the subtle movement of the mind, the restlessness, or the feeling of having a self, and all the conceit that goes with that. So that's a much even more refined level to be abandoned. So I found that description of those stages of awakening made a lot of sense to me. That being said, I think Longpo Cha, Ajahn Chah, and the great teachers generally advise one not to get too caught up in those things. We practice where we're at as best we can, and you never know. Awakening, I think, can occur to modern people. And I think there are teachers in North America, the world in general, but also in North America, who have attained. And that's, I think, if we really understand what that means, that we are capable of purifying ourselves completely, even in our strange, awkward, neurotic, modern state, then that should change the trajectory of a life. Because what else are you doing with your time? And that doesn't mean you have to take robes or anything like that. In the Buddha's time, there were lay people who attained every stage of awakening. Although if they attained arahantship, usually they went forth afterwards. But, and especially if you meet someone like that, and if you haven't watched some of the interviews with Longpo Cha, Ajahn Chah, say in Amaravati or in England, you should. They're just 5 minutes, they're on YouTube. But if you want to see what a being who is very different than anyone you've ever seen, probably, looks like, then it's right there. And what does that mean for our lives? for me, seeing that video was one of the reasons I went forth. Michael, can you talk about the advantages and benefits of the cold shower practice? Thanks. So I think Michael's referencing the advice I frequently give of taking a cold shower before meditation. And I stand by that. I know that cold water has been popularized recently by Wim Hof, although I haven't looked into that too much. But yeah, my sense is most Westerners and modern people are very much stuck in their heads. And as Ajahn Amaro says, our bodies are these things that we think of as keeping our necks from dragging on the ground. So in order to cultivate the somatic sense again, and to reestablish a real relationship with our body and all the subtle energies of the breath that are located in the body, and all the subtle voices of the mind and heart, which reside very much in the body. If we're going to get reacquainted with those softer voices of our nature, we have to find some way of dropping the awareness from the head where it's stuck all day because of the tightness of our diaphragms, because of the constant nodding of our breath bodies, because of the constant focus on thought and linear gaze. Then sometimes expedient means is very helpful. So Qigong is a really helpful practice. And I've found personally that a cold shower also really helps drop and clarify the breath energy. So yeah, it's very helpful. I recommend it. I don't know how many people take me up on it, and if you want to do Qigong, yeah, that is also very, very helpful. So I think there's all benefits of cold water. I don't see any downsides. I recently found out that Ajahn Brahm is 70 years old. I thought he was only in his 50s. It's very silly, but I was shocked. Nisabho, how old are you? Please don't be 50. I think there is, in the sutras, the Buddha does list benefits of various things, including the practice of metta, loving kindness. And one of those is a bright complexion. And I've met meditators who I could swear were about 30 and they were 50 or 60. So my sense is that if people really have a degree of samadhi or something, then, and even to an extent, I think lead clean and pure lives, it does show in the body. But especially if a practitioner, I think, has a deep level of concentration, then that that does show, as far as I can see, at least sometimes, it really shows on their face, and they seem ageless. And I don't think I fall into that category. I'm 32, so quite a ways to go. But Ajahn Brahm, I think he does look quite young. Okay. Phil E. I welcome any reflections you have on restlessness and boredom, like being stuck inside when it's 112 degrees outside. Feel my sympathies. Yeah, I mean, I did live in Thailand for many years, and there's certainly high temperatures there. I think sometimes, well, the cold showers are especially good in that situation, but it's helpful to recollect that sometimes there's a place, I think, for a certain realism that you find in the Buddhist teachings. I was speaking to someone recently, and we were talking about the power of how systems of thought overlay our lives and give them meaning and narrative. And the power of the Buddha's teaching in that it is such an encompassing and powerful overlay onto experience because it can take everything. So wherever we are, whatever difficulty we're going through, we always can look to those Four Noble Truths. And even the most mundane life and decisions, when brought into that framework, become profoundly significant and meaningful and charged with importance. Because since intention is the defining element of every action, no matter how trivial, and because that intention leads our hearts towards or away from their highest potential, which the path articulates so beautifully, purity of heart, then this fissure between good and evil, or at the more refined levels of practice, I think the metric of beautiful and unbeautiful is probably more helpful to think of, runs through every moment. So if your roommate leaves the dishes in the sink, then there's the decision to wash them or to leave them there. And right in that moment, there's a great decision to be made. And sometimes it's even more refined. You know, someone leaves laundry in the dryer. Do you just take it out, or do you actually fold it for them? And that's where I think that at the more refined levels of practice, this metric of good and evil, bad and good, aren't as helpful as beautiful and unbeautiful. What's the beautiful action? The Buddhist word for beautiful is kalyani. All this to say that this overlay comes into all experience or overall experience and gives it meaning. And I think one of the reasons why Buddhism is such a powerful overlay of meaning is because it takes as its central tenet and approach the experience of dukkha, the shared experience of suffering. Because it's not romantic. And it's much more inspiring to speak about high states of love and expansive awareness and divinity. But we do not have access to those all the time. And sometimes you're just lying on your sofa, sweating in 112-degree heat. And it does not, God's not there right then for you, at least as far as you're concerned, if you were a Christian. But dukkha's there, and the path to comprehend dukkha and really see it, and to let go of a bit of that attachment to the body, because the only way we let go of our attachments is by being burned a little bit. So there is use in that. And it also helps to really reflect on like the limits. This is samsara, and the body's a limited thing. The Buddha has a really wonderful sutta where an old man's approaching him about his sickening body, and the Buddha says, "It's true, this body is ill, prone to suffering, weak, feeble. Who would, even for a moment, except out of sheer foolishness, consider this body to be healthy, even for a moment?" So that's a harsh thing to say about the body, but it can help when you're just, these bodies are vulnerable things, and sometimes it's 112 degrees out, but you can still look at suffering. And there is use in that, in patient endurance, really. And over time, if one remains present through that experience and mindful, then there does become a slight distance from how we hold with such a tight-knuckled grip to these things in our lives. And one way or the other, the body and our comfort at the end of our lives will be torn from us. And if we've not managed to cultivate a bit of distance from it, just a little at least, then that's a brutal experience. So yeah, I think really patient endurance, that's, the Buddha said that's the supreme spiritual quality. And just as dukkha is a very solid and available central post to the teaching and to all experience in terms of looking to it and understanding it, just so patient endurance is a very available quality, and it is good to cultivate. So the Thais would say oton, patient endurance. Hello, Bante. I have a rather embarrassing question. Can you give advice for maintaining right concentration in the face of romance? I've got a strong infatuation going on, and I find myself becoming uncentered and more pulled towards the other person. Help. Oh, man. Yeah, monastic advice is going to be probably less useful than this in this one. I think it's just helpful to remember the priorities in life. And I think the meaning and how much weight our culture gives to romantic relationship, holding it up in how many movies, how many songs, is related to how we've forgotten where our hearts really need to be pointed and oriented. You know, the love of purity and of a pure heart and of kindness and of the transcendent and of the path to that, that's worthy of the heart and all of it. And yet that gets articulated so rarely in our culture, and we have so few practicable means towards it, that what begins to sort of take its place, I think, is a bit of romantic love. And so yes, there's just being drunk on romance and falling in love. I mean, that's an intense experience. And I think there's, you know, there's a lot of, it can be a powerful experience. I've fallen in love back as a layman. I think also being realistic about it, though. You know, studies show that after 3 years of marriage, happiness usually returns to its set point that was there before the marriage. And that's not to say that the two people can't work together and grow in mutual support and become an amazing partnership, but just that romantic flush, you know, it is passing. So I think keeping, you know, as powerful as the heart wants to, it, as much as the heart wants to turn and give itself completely to this, to also maybe this is the time where you really have to remind it of what its true center needs to be. So maybe there does need to be a bit, you know, maybe you need to put the shrine a bit closer to where you see it every day, and maybe give yourself to a bit more meditation and just maintain your center. Because if that magnet is drawing the heart, then you've got to just, you won't be able to totally stop it, obviously, but just hold up the other magnet that you know is correct in terms of true north. Remember your Polaris, and it's not romance. So I think that can be a helpful thing. And also just to remember that one can use these loves in one's life to reach through and touch a greater love. And that's the thing, is I think some people see, say, a renunciant and think that that's what the only way forward for them towards the spiritual path, or something like that. And yet, if one is existing in, you know, in the world and romance and all that, the ability to change and ennoble the heart is still very much there. But I think one just has to remember that every aspect of one's life in that case can be used as a tool to approach something greater in your own heart. So love for your children is a great thing, and yet it is limited to them. So to use it as a chance very consciously to cultivate a greater love that extends to all beings. And obviously one has duties towards one's children and will love them more in a lot of ways, and that's fine. But just to remember that every single act in a life can be a doorway to something much greater. And that doesn't diminish the thing. It makes it all the more beautiful. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say. But yeah, asking monastics for romantic advice, we may not give the best ones. Sorry. Can confirm that the cold shower method is great for mental clarity and conserving water. Thank you. Yes, good. I've got some other people, allies on board. Great. Catherine, other than cold showers, what else would you recommend before meditation? A qigong is very helpful. There's a book called The Way of Energy, which recommends these 5 standing poses. They're very simple, but they drop the awareness very effectively. I think exercise can be really good. Basically, if one is cultivating a robust approach to breath meditation, as taught by Ajahn Jeff, Ajahn Jayasaro, Ajahn Suchito, and others, then some expedient means of dropping the awareness is really, really, it's helpful. So I think that, but also some people really appreciate walking meditation. I know monks who, that was their main practice, is they'd walk for 8 hours a day, and sometimes they'd memorize suttas as they did it and chant. So that's worth experimenting with. There's a long chant that us monastics do called the Patimokkha. It's about 45 minutes, really fast, and it takes about a year or more to memorize. And yet, once you've memorized that, I know some monastics who say that their mind was never quite the same. It was in a good way, like it was much brighter after having that. And there's real benefit. Some of these words, for example, the chants worth memorizing, suttas worth memorizing, and this is a good thing to do before meditation sometimes, is the Anapanasati Sutta, mindfulness of breathing. In Pali, it's quite fun. The Dhammacakka Sutta, Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the turning of the wheel of Dhamma, the first discourse. I know Bhikkhu Bodhi said those are the most profound words that have ever been uttered by humanity, and I would agree. The whole teaching is right there. So that's worth doing before meditation too. And otherwise, maybe chanting and devotion, bowing to something worth bowing to, a shrine. There's a great teacher who says that when bowing has disappeared from the world, Buddhism will have disappeared from the world. So, okay. I think that's enough for now. It was lovely to see everyone, though. Oh, Savaka Umaro. Nisabho, how did you get your name? Did you pick it? If not, who did? My teacher gave it to me. In Thailand, depending on what day you were born, they use that to determine a bit of what your name is in terms of the first letter of it. So I think I was born on a Tuesday, so I have an N, Nisabho, and it means one who's excellent. So it's a great thing to try to live up to. And frequently, when people take refuge in a formal refuge ceremony as Buddhists, it's a beautiful ceremony. They can be given a Pali name as well. So I think that's worth doing if you have a teacher you deeply respect and you kind of want to really give yourself to something. formally, ritual is powerful. This is something our culture has forgotten. We remember that our internal inclinations affect our external actions. We like someone, so we give to them. We forget that external action very much affects internal inclination. This is a two-way street. So if you bow to a shrine the first thing as you wake up, it does affect your heart over time. And if you engage in a beautiful ceremony where you give yourself to this path and you receive a name, you don't always have to use it, but and you take refuge, it affects you. So yeah, if you have a teacher you deeply respect, who you're with for a time, it's something to contemplate. And you will also probably get a name. So, okay. All of you take care.